Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing some huge news. Finally, the ball has dropped. The Sharks have traded Timo Meier to the New Jersey Devils. I had mentioned yesterday that it felt as though that trade probably would have happened yesterday had it not been for the Patrick Marleau jersey retirement ceremony, and it seemed as though that was essentially getting pushed over to today, and indeed I was correct. The Meier trade ends up happening, and it broke about a few hours ago, but we only actually got all the details nailed down rather recently, and that is because this ends up being one of the biggest trades I have ever seen in terms of actual pieces and moving parts. Usually an NHL trade will involve a minimum of 2 pieces, sometimes even 1 actually if you don't count future considerations as a piece, but it can go up to like 4 or 5, or potentially blockbusters could have like 7 or 8. I believe the Erik Karlsson trade from a few years ago that brought him from Ottawa to San Jose involved 8 moving pieces. This one with Timo Meier involves 13 moving pieces, which is just absolutely absurd, and it also makes it very difficult to judge at face value exactly what this trade comes down to. Is it a win? Is it a loss? Did the Sharks go relatively even? Did they get fair value? Well, let us jump right into that. This trade was a long time coming. It feels as though not just in these past couple of weeks or couple of months, but it feels as though that even in the past when Meier wasn't heavily involved in trade rumors, you always occasionally heard like Meier getting traded to the Devils at like every entry draft, and it has become more serious this season with Meier on the expiring, even though it's an RFA contract, and the fact that the Sharks are seemingly now, especially with this deal, moving towards that rebuild over these next few years, and the Devils were immediately at the front in the line trying to get this player for that Swiss-born connection between Meier and Nico Hischier, and so Meier gets traded to the Devils along with Scott Harrington, Santeri Hatakka, Timur Ibragimov, Zach Amond, and a 2024 5th-round pick. In exchange, the San Jose Sharks get a 2023 first-round pick, a 2024 conditional, a very strict condition first-round pick, which we will get to a bit later, Shakir Mukhamadullin, defensive prospect for the New Jersey Devils, Zetterlund, Okadiak, Andreas Johnsson, as well as a 2024 7th-round pick. So like I said, a ton of pieces here, but let us start with the side in which the Sharks received. Obviously, the immediate reaction from many people viewing this trade is that there's not really any of those big names that people were, at least Sharks fans were hoping for. There is no Luke Hughes, there is no Casey, there is no Nemec, there is no Alex Holtz, which was really the big name that a lot of people were really involved with and thinking might end up getting moved from the Devils to the San Jose Sharks. So none of these big name prospects. And in terms of roster players, the player who a lot of Sharks fans were hoping for likely was Dawson Mercer. He also is not involved in this trade, so that is something that immediately jumps off the page and makes you think the Sharks lost this deal. But looking further into it, the Sharks did end up with 2 first-round picks potentially. The 2023 first-round pick is pretty much a guaranteed first-round pick. The only condition on it is that if somehow by a crazy set of circumstances the Devils were to miss the playoffs this season and then win the draft lottery and end up with a top 2 pick, this first-round pick would move to 2024. But in the pretty much every other universe where that doesn't happen, the 99.999% chance that the Devils will indeed make the playoffs, especially with this Timo Meier trade, the Sharks will end up with their first this year. It's likely that the Devils make the playoffs, but it's hard to say where they will end up finishing. It's possible with their inexperience they could be a first-round elimination or potentially a second-round elimination, and it's also possible with this young team, this hungry team, this unpredictable team, that they could go to the Eastern Conference Finals or potentially even the Stanley Cup Finals. Who knows? So this first-round pick, it likely will fall somewhere in the 20s, potentially on the earlier side, but also technically on the later side. It shows some decent value. The 2024 first-round pick is highly conditional, and that comes with the fact that this will be a second-round pick in 2024 unless the Devils are to either make the Eastern Conference Finals this year or next, which means every Sharks fan will become a New Jersey Devils fan for these next couple of years, at least for their Eastern Conference team, and Sharks fans will definitely be hoping that Meier not only will have some success, but that the Devils will have a lot of playoff success as well, so that they can get 2 first-round picks out of this. If the Devils don't actually end up making the Eastern Conference Finals, like I said, it becomes a second-round pick, which definitely heavily reduces the value of the return here for San Jose. Now, moving on to the actual players, first, the major prospect involved here is Mukhamadullin, the 4th best defensive prospect from the New Jersey Devils Devils side. Now, that might sound pretty bad just on the outlook, but it should be noted the Devils had one of the best prospect pools in the entire league. And so if, you looked at the Sharks' fourth best defensive prospect, you'd say like, oh, is it like Gannon Larocque or something like that? And you'd say that's not, it's insanely impressive. But from a Devils side, when you're behind Luke Hughes, Simon Nemec, and Casey, you're in a situation where Mukhamadullin can still be pretty good, and pretty good he seemingly is. Currently playing in the KHL, the final year of his KHL deal, should be coming over to North America at the end of this season. Seemingly has some offensive capabilities, is actually putting up a strong year in the KHL at the moment, but the big question mark is with his defensive zone capabilities. I don't know if he'll actually be involved with the San Jose Sharks main roster come next season, or if he'll end up being like Eklund and Bordeleau have been this year in the Barracuda for potential seasoning or anything like that. But Mukhamadullin likely becomes currently the Sharks' best defensive prospect, but the question really becomes, is this a situation where Mukhamadullin has top 2 potential? And I'm not entirely sure he does. At best, he probably ends up being a top 4 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, which is not necessarily a great thing in return for such a great player like Timo Meier. The next player on this list, and really the last valuable piece here, I would say, is Zetterlund, a middle 6 forward for the New Jersey Devils, still relatively young and has some decent promise. Obviously found himself stuck behind players like Jack Hughes, Jesper Bratt, Nico Hischier, Dawson Mercer, so never necessarily got a huge chance to sign in New Jersey, but still like a 25-point player on pace for around like 40 to 50 points, kind of comparable to, if we were to use a Sharks player as a comparison, Alex Barabanov, a kind of middle 6 kind of guy who will likely get some top 6 minutes for the San Jose Sharks, especially now over these next 22 games of the remaining regular season, especially with Timo Meier now gone. So we'll see how Zetterlund does in the expanded role. He's also 23 years old, which means he fits in a bit more with the San Jose Sharks' expected rebuilding window. The Sharks are likely to hoping to at least attempt to be competitive within the next maybe 3 years from now or so. At that point, Zetterlund will be 26 years old, which would definitely still be quite solid. So he's a decent piece here, but that is the major issue with this trade on immediately first glance, is that there are a couple of decent pieces, but no really sweet, nice, amazing piece here for the Sharks to look at and say, this is something that we wanted. Mukhamadullin and Zetterlund are both good. The 2 first-round picks, or at least the 2 potential first-round picks, are good, but they're not great, and Timo Meier is great. So this is a trade that your general feeling towards it isn't that great. It is one that I will say in the next, let's say, 3 years, we can look back on this trade and say, wow, that was a fantastic trade. Zetterlund really panned out and actually ends up being a good second liner. Mukhamadullin ends up being a great top 4 defenseman. Both of those 2 first-round picks, if that, of course, comes to be, both those 2 first-round picks are looking like really good prospects. So in 3 years, we could look back on this deal and say that was a fantastic move for San Jose. But it's also possible we look back in 3 years and say, well, they got a second-round pick in 2024. The 2023 first-round pick ends up being, not that great. Mukhamadullin ends up being like a second-pair guy, maybe Zetterlund like a third liner. And we look back and say, not so good. Anyhow, moving on to the last few pieces here from the Devils, not anything to write home about. Arkadiuk is a prospect, but more of like a C-tier kind of guy, someone who maybe makes it as like a 6th or 7th defenseman for the San Jose Sharks in the next couple of years, but realistically probably doesn't have too much potential to him. Andreas Johnsson is essentially just a throw-in piece of like moving a roster, moving some cap around, so there's nothing special there. He hasn't even played at all almost this season. He has like 10 minutes of ice time, and then a 7th round pick in 2024. But now let's look up at what the Sharks gave, because it's not just Timo Meier for 7 pieces in return. In fact, the Sharks actually ended up giving up some relatively memorable names. So first we have Scott Harrington, a relatively replaceable 7th defenseman, certainly not too bad. And then a couple of prospects he bragged Ibragimov and Amond, who really had been clearly heavily passed on the Sharks depth chart. Ibragimov was like not even in the top 15 or 20 names likely for the San Jose Sharks, and Amond had been leapfrogged by multiple Sharks goaltending prospects. But obviously the big name that jumps out here in terms of Sharks prospects given up in this deal is Santeri Hatakka. Coming into this season, I would say Hatakka was likely viewed, potentially at the very least, as the Sharks' best defensive prospect. Now, with his season thus far this year being injured a lot and not playing too many games with the Barracuda, you could certainly argue that he has been leapfrogged by, let's say, Artemi Kniazev, potentially Gannon LaRocque, or Cam Lund, these types of players. That is technically possible, but that certainly still means that Hatakka is a decent defensive prospect for San Jose. He has played NHL games and shown some decent things in those NHL games, and he is now being traded in this deal to the New Jersey Devils. And so if I'm looking at the comparison, obviously Mukhamadullin is going to have more promise than Hatakka, but does Hatakka have less promise than Okadiak, the defensive prospect, the other defensive prospect that the Sharks are getting back here? Probably not. That might be my San Jose Sharks bias. I'm not really aware of what this Devils prospect has done, but I do know that Hatakka at the very least has some NHL games under his belt and seemingly could have been like a bottom pairing at the very least, maybe even like a second pairing kind of guy for San Jose, and now he's being traded. And then on top of that, weirdly enough, the Sharks end up giving up a 5th round pick in this deal for this is not a Sharks 5th round pick, this is a Colorado Avalanche 5th round pick, but still, it's kind of odd that right at the tail end of this deal is a 5th for 7th swap. So the Sharks end up moving down in the 2024 draft. If I'm looking at the values without these draft picks, I wouldn't be the one to think that the Sharks would have to add the more valuable pick, but I guess what do I know? So in general, looking at this trade, this is 13 pieces, so difficult to judge, but without that big name that is jumping off the board from the New Jersey Devils side compared to the obviously huge name that is jumping off the board from the Sharks side in Timo Meier, it seems like somewhat of a weak trade and not really something that gets me out of bed in the morning and saying like, yes, the Sharks have a bright future here. So we'll see how it pans out, but at the moment, not super hopeful. Class dismissed.